Welcome to MMA Line Movement's Octagon Outlook. I am James Lynch. So happy to be here and so happy for you to be joining me here today. If you haven't watched this channel before, we're going to be providing you with some of the best interviews and content in the MMA industry going forward. I just posted an interview this morning with Colby Covington. We did about 30 minutes getting his reaction to the UFC 251 main event. And we're going to be bringing you guys interviews every week. I am so happy to be a part of this team, linemovement.com, MMA Line Movement, which is getting into the MMA space from a betting perspective. Really excited about some of the stuff we're going to be doing here. And just a little quick background on me. If you guys haven't watched me before, I've been involved in the industry for over 10 years, covered a number of UFC events, and just really happy to bring my interviews here and also some insight here on this show, which you're going to be seeing every week. So this will be a recap and preview show. This week's a little bit different. We got 3 UFC cards. Obviously, we had the one on Saturday, and we'll have the one on Wednesday and the one on Saturday. So we'll get into all that. Won't be able to get to every single fight, but we will talk about all the important ones, and that's the most important thing here. So really excited to be a part of this team, like I mentioned. Hope everyone had a good weekend. UFC 251, let's start there. Really great card. Obviously, some controversy in some of the fights with the judging, but let's start first with the main event. We had Kamaru Usman getting a unanimous decision over Jorge Masvidal. Usman closing on most books is around a 2-1 favorite. Usman, I think if you looked at this fight on paper, you knew that he was a guy that had a superior advantage with his wrestling. And I'll give credit to Masvidal. He definitely was game in this fight. He didn't get finished. He had his moments. He obviously got to display his stand-up, and we saw that in the first round. Masvidal having a pretty good first round there. I think most people felt like he did win that first round. You might have been able to give that to Usman as well, but Masvidal coming out really good and just getting to display his striking. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people heading into this fight, you know, they saw all the last 3 Jorge Masvidal fights. They were all very exciting. The Nate Diaz one, the knockout over Askren, and the knockout over Till. So we were a little bit spoiled with Jorge Masvidal. So I think going into this fight, people had higher expectations about the entertainment value of this fight, and I don't think it really delivered from that perspective. But if you're Kamaru Usman, you get your opponent switched up at the last minute or during, week before, and it's tough for you to kind of compete with that. So I think in general, Usman did what he had to do. The pressure was on him in this fight. Masvidal had nothing to lose going into this one. Let's be honest here. He has double-digit losses. He's still going to get big fights going forward, even after losing to Usman here. But let's go into the in depth with the fight. Obviously, Usman able to use his wrestling, able to use his conditioning. I like the game plan here of where he was putting Masvidal against the fence, using the toe stomps. I know people don't like that, but that's still a good game plan for him, trying to neutralize Masvidal's stand-up, because while I don't really consider Masvidal a power puncher, he is a guy that does that is able to finish. And I think even though Usman's not a guy that's easy to finish in his career, it's still something he shouldn't be giving that advantage to Masvidal in the fight. So Usman obviously looking good in the cage. I think that move to Elevation Fight Team and working with Trevor Whitman and Justin Gaethje paid off. The cardio looked even better on Saturday night, and he got the job done. I think that's sort of the main thing here. So what do we take away from this fight? Well, we know that Jorge Masvidal does not want to fight Colby Covington. I talked to Colby about that in the interview. You guys got to check that out. Had some good insight about that. But I really don't think there's a bad option here for Masvidal going forward. Personally, I don't want to see the Leon Edwards fight. I don't think people really care that they had that confrontation last year. I think most people forgot about that. I think with Masvidal, his money fights going forward. I think the Colby fight's a fight you do. They have that built-in storyline of 2 former teammates. So guys will notice on here, I do like making a lot of pro wrestling references. Just that was what I grew up watching. And I love a good, teammate versus teammate fight. I mean, they're ex-teammates now. I think that would be very interesting. And it would be an interesting matchup. Masvidal, obviously great stand-up, but the wrestling is a bit of a question mark, and that's where Colby really excels. So that's a fight you can do. How about Conor McGregor? I don't hear enough people talking about this. Yes, McGregor's retired, but we're talking about MMA retirements here. This is not something that we're used to seeing, guys staying on the shelf for too long. How many fighters have come out of retirement and taken a big money fight? Look at George St. Pierre. That's a prime example right there. So I think that's the biggest fight the UFC could do right now. And I think if you're Conor McGregor, you're probably looking at that fight on Saturday and going, you know what? He's not going to take me down. He's probably not going to try and submit me. This would be a fan-friendly fight, and I think would do huge numbers. But if I'm looking at this from the UFC's perspective, I'm probably waiting to do that fight next year when we get some crowds back. I think that's probably more likely of a scenario. And then there's Nate Diaz in this equation. And yes, I realize that Diaz lost to Masvidal last time. And look, if we're watching that first fight they had at UFC 244, I don't think anyone felt like Diaz was going to turn the corner despite the doctor stoppage. But we're talking about 2 big names there, and now they're both coming off losses. It may make sense there, and we know Nate Diaz is not just going to come out of retirement for anybody. He's got to come out for a big money fight. And I think despite the fact that the first fight I don't think was that competitive, I think that is a fight that's still on the table for Jorge Masvidal. So those are the options for him. Now with Usman, I mean, it's a pretty run-of-the-mill type opponents, I think, from him going forward. Now that he beat Masvidal, now that that's out of the way, the BMF champ, I think you'll see him, fight whoever else is sort of in line as far as the talent goes. You've got guys like, Gilbert Burns, his former teammate, the guy who's supposed to be fighting on Saturday. I think that's definitely an interesting option as far as that matchup, because I think that's a lot closer. Burns, great stand-up. Great jiu-jitsu. We never see the jiu-jitsu from Burns because he's been knocking guys out the last couple of fights. So that's interesting. Plus, they've trained together. There's that interesting aspect as well. So Dana White said that Burns and Usman is probably going to happen next. I tend to believe that. I think that's what you will see happen, maybe in the fall, maybe in the winter, but it definitely, I think, will be next. And then you've got Leon Edwards in this situation as well. Does Edwards wait out for the winner of Burns and Usman? It's possible, but it's been so long that Edwards has fought. He was supposed to fight Tyron Woodley back on the UFC London card before the coronavirus canceled that card. So that's another thing too when you're looking at this, at the options for Usman going forward. Does he fight a guy like Leon Edwards maybe down the line? I think that's definitely possible, but I think Edwards might have to take another fight. I think at this point, you probably do Edwards and Wonderboy Thompson. They both don't have dance partners. You do Usman and Burns, and you do Masvidal against any of those opponents I just mentioned. That's how I sort of see the welterweight division panning out. But by all means, if you're watching this, leave a comment below. Let me know who you think should be next for Usman and for Masvidal. Let's get to the co-main event. A lot of controversy here. A lot of people upset. If you guys follow me on Twitter, I did let my scorecards known for this fight, and I thought Volkanovski won the fight. Now, look, I get people being upset. Holloway certainly made a strong case for winning that fight. And I think what this fight really comes down to is that third round. So if you're watching that fight, I think most people would agree with this. Max Holloway won the first and second round. I think there's no debate on that. Holloway definitely looked like the old Holloway, the one that we saw defeat Jose Aldo 2 times. Really aggressive, getting those kicks, getting those body shots. I mean, he looked great. And I really thought that Holloway was going to cruise and win the rest of the rounds. That's the way things were looking. But Volkanovski made some adjustments. Now, I want to go a bit more in depth in the third round because, again, I think that's where people need to throw the R word out the window because this, in my opinion, this wasn't a robbery because I think there's clear rounds that Volkanovski won. The third round, I thought he won, but that was the closest round of the fight. So for me, what I look at is a couple things. Number one, in that round, Volkanovski blocked a couple kicks from Holloway. I think that's very key. I know he tried to get the takedown and it didn't work out, but still he was making the effort to do so. But the other thing that I don't think people are talking about is that counter left that took place in the third round. And also he had a 3-punch combination in that third round as well that I think people are sort of forgetting. The commentary on Saturday, just watching it, I think was a little biased towards Max Holloway. So I think that's sort of skewing some judgment as well. But that third round, like I said, no issues if you give that to Max Holloway or to Volkanovski, in my opinion, because it was such a close round. But that really decided the fight because I think 4 and 5, and I'm curious to get your guys' thoughts in the comments. I thought 4 and 5 were clearly Volkanovski, especially that fifth round where he was able to get the takedown. He finished the round strong. I just think Volkanovski did enough there to get the nod. And again, when we're looking at a robbery, I like to look at a fight like Diego Sanchez and Ross Pearson. I know it's a couple years old, but go back and watch that fight. I don't think Diego Sanchez won a single round of that fight. I don't care if you're the biggest Max Holloway fan in the world. You have to look at the fact that Volkanovski won some of those rounds, especially 4 and 5. 3, I could understand people going Holloway's way, but 4 and 5, I think were pretty clearly Volkanovski. So to me, that's not a robbery. A robbery to me is where a guy clearly didn't win any of the rounds and he ended up losing, or he ended up winning the fight, I should say. So that's where I would go with that one. But again, if that's 48-47 Max Holloway, no complaints over here. Great fight. What happens next? That's the big question here. Some people suggesting a trilogy. I'm not so sure. I don't know if the UFC is very high on that with the fact that now officially, and say what you want about the judges, officially Alexander Volkanovski has 2 wins over Max Holloway. And if you're Holloway, why are you sticking around in the featherweight division? Maybe you fight one more time. Maybe they do the trilogy. I guess they could go that route. But at the same time, I look at Holloway and I look at the fact that, he had a good reign as champion. Maybe it's time to move up to lightweight. I know the failed experiment last year going up and fighting Dustin Poirier didn't work out for him. But in general, I think that's something he should look at because I just think there's bigger fights. Imagine Holloway against Tony Ferguson or against, someone like Al Iaquinta, which I think is a winnable fight for him, but a pretty big name. I think those are the type of fights that people would be very interested in. And I think it's a little bit more lucrative for him from a financial standpoint as well. So I think lightweight is the way to go for Holloway. But if the UFC seems very interested in having that trilogy fight down the line with how close the fight was on Saturday, I think then you could make that as an option. Maybe down the road, maybe Holloway fights like a Yair Rodriguez or Zabit Magomedsharipov or someone out there. So we'll have to sort of see what they decide to do with Holloway. Now with Volkanovski, a lot of options there. Korean Zombie, I think, is the leading candidate right now. There was some rumors about him fighting Brian Ortega. I think a lot of fans want to see the Ortega fight, but it just seems like they can't get that fight together. So maybe Korean Zombie leapfrogs that fight and gets the title shot. We'll see. You've also got Zabit. You also got Yair Rodriguez, like I mentioned. And let's not forget, and we'll talk about this later on the show, but we've got Dan Ige and Calvin Kattar fighting on Wednesday. I mean, if there's a finish in that fight, recency bias is a real thing in MMA. I mean, if one of those guys gets a big win there, don't be surprised if they leapfrog some of those contenders and get a title shot as well. That could happen. We've seen it happen before in the UFC. Let's continue on with the card. Petr Yan getting a finish over Jose Aldo to become the new bantamweight champion. I love this fight. This answered a lot of questions about Petr Yan heading into the fight, because the big question was he hadn't fought the type of competition that Aldo had, but it didn't seem to matter because Yan did a fantastic job getting the finish. Unfortunately, what a lot of people are talking about with this fight was the late stoppage. Aldo taking a lot of unnecessary blows later in the fight. The referee definitely should have stepped in a lot sooner. And hopefully that doesn't overshadow Yan's performance, because I thought this was amazing. Now, Aldo looked good in the early going, using those leg kicks. Where have these been the last couple of fights with Jose Aldo, right? So for him to go and use some leg kicks, get some good shots in there, I thought that was a good performance from Aldo. But ultimately, Yan showed that he is the real deal. Younger guy, true bantamweight, a guy that's been fighting at bantamweight his whole career. It really showed in this fight, and he gets the title. And the thing I love the most about Yan in this fight, after the fight, what did he say? What did he do when he went on the podium? He says he wants to fight Sterling. That's how this sport should be. He's not trying to call out Volkanovski. He's not trying to call out all these other guys for big money fights. He wants the division to continue, and I think that's great. And I think Sterling absolutely is the number one contender with his big win over Corey Sandhagen earlier this year. As far as what's next for Aldo, I think you could do like a Dominic Cruz fight. That would be kind of fun, just like a big name fight. But I've always wanted to see Aldo at 155. I don't know if that's something he wants to do at this point. Again, there's a lot of big fights at 155, but my gut tells me he's going to stay at bantamweight and probably fight a name fighter like a Dominic Cruz next. That would probably be my best bet. And of course, on the card as well, we had Rose Namajunas avenging her loss to Jessica Andrade last year. I was so impressed by this fight and by Rose's performance. It wasn't easy. I mean, Rose definitely took some damage in this fight, taking some shots from Andrade, but ultimately she gets the split decision. Let's be honest, though, this should have been a unanimous decision. I thought Rose clearly won the fight. You could have maybe given the third round to Jessica Andrade, but Rose clearly won the matchup and likely going to be fighting Weili Zhang next. Andrade, I think you do the rematch with Ioana and Jacek next. I think that makes a lot of sense. And of course, opening up the card, we had Amanda Ribas getting a quick win over Paige Van Zandt. That is the last time we'll see Paige Van Zandt in the UFC. I have no doubt about it. She's going to be going to join her husband, Austin Vanderford, in Bellator. Couldn't have gone worse for Paige Van Zandt, and couldn't have gone any better for the UFC and Amanda Ribas. Seems like they're very high on her. Great personality. You saw the interviews during fight week. She's someone they're going to continue to build in the strawweight division. And the reason I say strawweight is because this fight was at flyweight. A lot of people got confused by that. I saw some people saying, hey, she's going to be, a nice breath of fresh air in the flyweight division. She's not a flyweight. She just took this fight, I think, because Van Zandt could not make 115. So expect her back in the strawweight division after this as she looks to continue her mark there. And then just some other highlights quickly from the card as we move along here. We had Yuri Prohaska, beautiful win over Volkan Ozdemir. Ozdemir is a very tough guy to finish. If you guys remember, the only other time he's been finished in the UFC was against Cormier, and that took place in the second round. So the fact that we had a newcomer come in here, and I know Prohaska had a lot of fights in Rise, and I know he had a lot of highlight reel finishes, but didn't fight anyone close to the level of Volkan Ozdemir heading into Saturday night. So the fact that he went out there, not only was clowning around a little bit, I'll be honest, I was watching this, I was a little bit worried. I was like, this guy's going to get knocked out if he continues doing this, but he was able to persevere. He did take a few shots, but he ended up knocking out Volkan Ozdemir and really cementing himself in the light heavyweight division, because Ozdemir was ranked number 7. So that puts him in a good spot. I already see people saying this guy's like Johnny Walker. We're going to start to overrate him. I don't think so. I think this is a quality win there for Yuri. Excited to see what's next for him. And they don't have a lot of light heavyweight prospects in that division. So I think just, to be able to build off that and to use him as someone they can look forward to, because Walker, let's be honest here, Johnny Walker, I just referenced, he's got 2 straight losses. They got to build him back up again. A guy like Yuri coming in here and, really breathing some new life into that division, I think is awesome. And for Volkan Ozdemir, tough setback, but, he's a guy that I'm sure will be back better than ever. We had some controversial decisions on the undercard as well. I thought the Muslim Sakalov fight and Zaleski fight totally went the wrong way. I thought Zaleski should have won that fight. I thought that was a worse decision than the Holloway fight, to be honest. I don't know how the judges gave it to Sakalov, but hopefully Zaleski will live to see another day. I think that's back-to-back losses for him since losing on Saturday night. Let me just double check so I don't get any people in the comment section. Oh, he came off the win over Kuchikano. That's right. So still losing 2 of 3 doesn't look good on the resume. So hopefully they will book him up after that. And Salikov, we'll see. He's 17-2 now. Obviously, they're very high on him. And then the other controversial fight as well was the Pavia and Zumagulov fight in the flyweight division. Zumagulov, I thought, clearly won this fight. Pavia, good effort, but I don't see how the judges thought he won. Clearly some issues with the judging on this card. See, these two I had an issue with in terms of the robbery, but in general, I think this was one that yeah, should have gone the other way as far as that goes. And then just quickly, I'll mention on this card as well, Leo Santos, poor guy, had to endure all types of DQs and low nut shots and then the illegal knee, and manages to pull off the win here, improves to 18-3 overall. Bogotov's stock could have not gone lower, not only suffering his first career loss, but also a guy that is now considered a dirty fighter. You don't want to have that on the resume. The other two I wanted to mention quickly before we move on, Mccann Amirkhani, beautiful submission over Danny Henry, nice bounce back from that loss to Shane Burgos, and of course opening up the card, we had Davey Grant, first knockout win since 2012, knocking out Martin Day. This was a fight I think he was on his way to losing. So for Grant to go out there and get a knockout and like I said, have his first knockout since 2012, good timing for Davey Grant as he looks to continue his run in the bantamweight division. All right. That was UFC 251. Any questions you guys have on this fight, let me know in the comments. I'll get to you as soon as I can. We've got a card on Wednesday, though, and it's a really good one. Calvin Kattar and Danny Ige headlining this event. We'll start with some of the fights on the prelims here quickly. One of the ones I'm really interested in is Aaron Phillips and Jack Shore. Jack Shore is going to be a very big favorite heading into this fight. We're sort of seeing that just with his resume and what he's been able to do, and the fact that Aaron Phillips is taking this on short notice on the undercard, doesn't bode well for him. So right now, Jack Shore is the biggest favorite on here. If you're looking at everything sort of heading into this fight with his record and everything else. But, it's interesting. Aaron Phillips is a guy that, has been in the UFC before. I think a lot of people forget that. He fought twice in 2014 and he went 0-2 and he got cut. And then he went on the regional scene. And I think he's coming in on a nice winning streak on this fight. So this is one I would be keeping an eye on just because I do think Phillips is battle tested. He's a guy that I don't think should be counted out. But Jack Shore, again, just such a stud when it comes to, what his pedigree is in. We know the work that he did in his UFC debut. And also just the fact that here is a guy that, is a former Cage Warriors champion. So he's a guy that, again, we're very, very high on, and I think the UFC's high on him too. That's why they put him on this card. So, it should be an interesting fight. I just always love seeing a scenario where you have an underdog like this who's has some experience. It's not like they're being rushed into this and they're going to, potentially pull off an upset like this. But I think Jack Shore will end up pulling this one off. So I spoke to Aaron Phillips last week. He mentioned to me that, look, it's not like he's coming off the couch here. He is a guy that had a training camp heading into this one. He actually thought he was going to fight for Titan FC. So he was sort of prepping for that. So this is nothing new for him. And he got to Abu Dhabi well in advance. So it should be a pretty fun fight as far as that goes on the prelims. The other fight I wanted to take a look at on the prelims is Modestas Bukauskas taking on a newcomer. Well, they're both newcomers, I should say, in Andreas Michailidis. Michailidis, if you remember, fought in Titan FC. So we have seen him a bit. You can go watch his fights on Fight Pass. But Bukauskas is a guy that, like I said, another Cage Warriors guy here, a really exciting fighter at the 205-pound division. Now, if you remember, he got signed earlier this year. They just needed to get him a fight. This is a good matchup for him. He's another guy I would be keeping an eye on in this fight, on this card, I should say, just because of the pedigree he had coming in. I think the UFC is very high on him. And like I said, not too old. Let me just check his age here. He is 26 years old, so a lot of promise here. We talked earlier about Yuri Prohaska. This is another guy in the 205-pound division that you can see the UFC wanting to build on as well. Another interesting fight on the prelims as well that I'll reference, Jared Gordon and Chris Fishgold. Jared Gordon going down to featherweight for the first time since 2017. And with all that extra travel, and we just found out last week that his cornerman will not be able to make the trip because they've tested positive for COVID-19. Paul Felder actually getting pulled from the broadcast booth to go corner Jared Gordon. How much is that going to impact him? And the fact that Gordon's got to cut some extra weight, like I said, hasn't fought at featherweight since 2017. That's something to keep an eye on. Jared Gordon also in a different camp now. He's training at Sanford MMA as opposed to Rufus Sports. So we'll see if those paid off as far as some of the changes. And he's facing Chris Fishgold, who had a tough UFC run. I mean, he's had to fight nothing but killers. Had to fight Calvin Kattar in his debut. And then he's coming off that loss to Mccann Amirkhani, but spoke to Fishgold as well. Very fired up for this fight. I think you can expect to see him put on a good performance. And if I'm picking this fight, I'm going Chris Fishgold just with the fact that he's a guy that's been at that division more, at least recently. And I think there's too many X's against Jared Gordon. I think Gordon might be the better fighter, but I think in general, him making that cut, him traveling, him doing all these extra things, I think it is going to impact him in this fight. So give me Chris Fishgold in that fight. But let's get to the main card. A lot of exciting matchups. This initially was the co-main event. We've got Razak Al-Hassan taking on Munir Lazez. If I'm not mistaken, let me just look at my notes here. Munir Lazez is a Team Nogueira product. So he's a guy that comes from a really good camp, and he's facing a guy in Razak Al-Hassan who hasn't fought in a while. If you guys remember, he had some legal trouble outside the cage. So his last fight was actually back in 2018. He got that knockout win over Nico Price. The thing that concerns me a bit, aside from the layoff, is also the fact that Al-Hassan is 34 years old. So he's not a young guy. He's facing a guy who's sort of an up-and-comer here. But if you look at the experience, I mean, Al-Hassan has fought, nothing but the who's who in the UFC. Well, I shouldn't say the who's who, but he has a lot more fights in the UFC is kind of what I'm getting at. His only loss is to Armari Akhmedov, who's not even a welterweight anymore. He fights at middleweight, has some really good finishes there as well. And let's not forget, Razak Al Hassan trains at a great camp at Fortis MMA. That is a camp to keep an eye on because obviously they have Jeff Neal and a lot of the other standout fighters there. So Razak Al Hassan really getting to train with some of the best. So I think that's going to serve him well in this fight. I am going to pick him, but the layoff does concern me in this fight. I'll probably just stay away from this from a betting perspective, but I do think that Razak Al Hassan is a guy that will probably win this fight by knockout. The other fight on the main card, we got Molly Mccann taking on Talita Santos. Close fight. I do give the edge to Molly Mccann as far as that goes. I do see, that her being the betting favorite, but in general, I think that she's someone that, just has really found her stride. She had that tough UFC debut a few years ago against Jillian Robertson, where, she got submitted in the second round, but since then been undefeated. Another Cage Warriors vet coming into this one. I think we've seen sort of the old form of Molly Mccann in her last couple fights. And I think she'll do quite well here. Three fight win streak. I think she'll pull off the decision in this one over Talia Santos. Really good card that just got added like last week. Jimmy Rivera and Cody Stamen. Now this fight's actually at featherweight. After speaking to both fighters, from what I heard, it was on Stamen's end because obviously Stamen not a big bantamweight, but he does have to cut a lot of weight. He's a pretty stocky guy, so I actually think that helps Stamen in this fight because he's got a little bit more muscle than Jimmy Rivera. The interesting thing about this fight is that Rivera is the betting favorite, but I think actually you would almost want to look at Stamen as a potential play here just because of the fact that he's fought more. I mean, he just fought Brian Kelleher, what was it, like a month ago, not even. And Rivera hasn't fought since, I want to say 2019. Let me just look here. I believe the last fight he had was against Piotr Jan, and that was back in, as Tapology is loading for me here, that was back in June of last year. So he's had more than a year-long layoff. He also tested positive for the coronavirus a couple months ago. So I know he feels fine now, but that's one of the things also to keep in mind for this fight. I think on paper, Rivera might be the better fighter, but the layoff and everything, I think if you're looking to bet this fight, Cody Stamen might be worth a play just because he's an underdog and he does have some momentum coming into this fight. So keep that in mind for this fight as well, but should be an interesting fight as both have taken this on short notice. I spoke to both fighters and both are ready to go and ready to go. And obviously Rivera needs this win more than anyone because he's coming on a pretty big losing streak. But I did ask him, I think he's got a couple fights in his UFC contract, so I don't see them cutting them even if he loses here. Let's talk about the co-main event. Awesome fight in the flyweight division. Tim Elliott against Ryan Benoit. Tim Elliott, the betting favorite in this one, but coming into this one off a couple losses. This is kind of surprising. You don't see guys come off of 3 straight losses and still get another fight with the UFC. I think the UFC knows he's an exciting guy. That's why they gave him another opportunity here. And Ryan Benoit, we know how good he is. I mean, he had that win over Sergio Pettis years ago, but really has just struggled to find consistency. He lost that split decision to Brandon Moreno, lost to Ben Wynn as well. They both have lost to Ben Wynn, actually, should point that out. But you look at some of the wins here. I mean, other than Pettis, a lot of these guys just aren't in the UFC. So it's really tough to say, where he is in terms of his skill set. Elliott, a lot more experience. I mean, here's a guy that fought for the flyweight title as well. And Elliott's back is against the wall. So I think Elliott should be the favorite in this fight. And I'm actually going to pick him to win here. I think the urgency is going to be a little bit more because he does have the losing streak, because he probably didn't think he was going to get another fight. And the other thing I love about Tim Elliott in this fight, he went back to his roots for this one. He's actually training in Missouri at Glory MMA with James Krause. I think that's a great move for him. Get out of Vegas, get out of his regular environment, go there, train there with some killers. Grant Dawson, one of the guys who trains there as well, has a fight coming up too. So I think that's going to bode well for Tim Elliott, but I'll take him by decision in this one because I don't think he's going to do anything crazy. I think he knows he needs to get a win in this fight, and I think Tim Elliott will end up pulling this one off. Let's get to the main event here. Really exciting fight in the featherweight division. We've got Calvin Kattar taking on Danny Ige. I see Calvin Kattar is the favorite right now. And that makes sense. To me, Calvin Kattar is the better fighter here. If you look at this on paper, I think Kattar does things in his fights that make you think he could be a featherweight contender, a potential featherweight title challenger down the line. Whereas with Danny Ige, he's getting a lot of good wins and nothing to take away from that. He's got some quality wins too in Bektik and Edson Barbosa. But I feel like with Danny Ige, he's a guy that just wasn't given any, talented gifts. He's what I sort of equate him to is like a blue collar worker. Like he's a guy that outworks everyone in the room and he's just going off what he has. I don't think there's anything special that he does, but I think he is a guy that will never quit, will never give up. And that's why he's gotten an opportunity like this. And that's why he got the nod in his last fight, was because of the fact that, he presses the action. He doesn't quit. There was a point in that Edson Barbosa fight where I thought Barbosa might have been able to finish him, but Ige persevered and ended up winning the fight. Now, look, I don't think Ige won that last fight against Edson Barbosa, but you can't ignore the fact that Ige does find that way to win, and he'll make it tough on Calvin Kattar. But Calvin Kattar, I mean, here's a guy, we got to go over the resume here a little bit. only guy to finish Shane Burgos in the UFC, has fought nothing but killers. His losses, I mean, Moicano, I think if they rematch, that might be a different story. But the Zabit fight, I mean, that was a close fight. I mean, Zabit clearly won, but I think if that had gone 2 more rounds, Calvin Kattar might have found some success and might have even been able to pull off the win there. Kattar's fighting nothing but killers. And then you look at the fight, his last fight, he got that knockout win over Jeremy Stevens. I mean, that just is, you know, that was just such an impressive win to me. And like I said, he's finishing these opponents. He's not just going the distance with them. So I think what's going to happen in this fight, Calvin Kattar going to keep this fight standing. His boxing is going to really show in this one that he's a little bit ahead of Ige in that department. And I think he'll wear Ige down. And I see potentially a late finish for Calvin Kattar, maybe like in the 4th or 5th round, or a situation where Kattar just pulls off a decision in this one. Because again, Ige never been finished in his career. He's a Hawaiian. Those guys are tough as nails. You can't just knock out a Hawaiian in the first round. That, you know, it takes a couple of rounds to do it. Look at Martin Day. It took him till the 3rd round to get knocked out by Davey Grant last week. So I do expect Kattar to have his hand raised. And I think this is going to be an important fight for him to really tell us where he fits in that top 5 of the featherweight division. And I think Dan Ige's streak comes to an end here. Now, look, could Ige go out there and surprise everyone and pull off another decision? Absolutely. I mean, like I said, this is a guy that's very tough to put away and has a lot of heart, but again, I think if we're looking at the 2 fighters, it's hard not to go with Calvin Kattar just with the body of work he's done in the UFC compared to Danny Ige. So I got to go Calvin Kattar on that card. All right. We've got another card to preview here, Saturday's card, which is the rematch between Deiveson Figueiredo and Joseph Benavidez for the vacant flyweight title. Now, at the time we're doing this, Figueiredo is on the plane. There were some talks last week of him testing positive for COVID-19. I mean, the UFC was advertising the fight as is. We're going to continue with that as is. I think the fight will end up happening, but something, you know, with COVID, you never know. Things could postpone there. So we will be previewing that fight. But just looking at the prelims here, the one fight that stands out to me, because it's a guy that I've covered for years, is Malcolm Gordon, a newcomer, taking on Amir Al-Abazi. Interesting fight for both guys, both making their debut. Now, Gordon's a guy that has been carving out his niche on the regional scene for a while. He came over from TKO, which is a pretty outstanding promotion on the Canadian side of things. We've seen a lot of TKO fighters make that move to the UFC, including Cyril Gane, Charles Jourdain. I think TJ Laramie is another TKO guy you'll see in the UFC very soon, but Malcolm Gordon is the latest one. And his last win absolutely proved that. I mean, it was back in 2019, but he got a win over Yoni Sherbatov. If that name sounds familiar, Yoni was on The Ultimate Fighter, if you remember. He had some success on the show, but ended up losing. And part of that, too, is he had a family tragedy. But Yoni Sherbatov is a very quality flyweight fighter. And for Malcolm Gordon to go out there and submit him in the first round just speaks to how talented he is in this fight. So really impressed by what Gordon's been able to do. Gordon also has a win. And he actually had this win before this fighter got in the UFC, but he has a win over Chris Kalades. If you remember him, when he used to fight in the UFC, the Canadian flyweight, he had a decision win over him. I was actually at that fight. That was at Bellator 119, the last time Bellator ever came to Canada. Really big win there. And yeah, Gordon, like I said, just fighting really top-notch competition. So I think he'll be ready to fight a guy in Al-Bazi who, 26 years old, fought some good competition. The guy he fought in Brave last to get in the UFC was 5-1, but he did lose to Jose Shorty Torres, who was a UFC vet. So that makes me think maybe he can't, when he gets that step up in competition, maybe he can't hack it here in general. So I'm going to pick Malcolm Gordon in this fight just because I think he's a little bit more battle tested on the regional scene. And, I was able to speak with him last week. The spirits are good. He's got Sam Stout in his corner. The former UFC lightweight's going to be there. Of course, Gordon is a original member of Team Tompkins, which was a great team back in the day with the late Sean Tompkins. There was Chris Horodecki. There was Sam Stout, Mark Hominick. So Gordon sort of paying tribute to them by having him in his corner. And I still think that's a good move just because Sam Stout is a guy that, for the most part is really, just good to have as far as that goes and everything else. So yeah, Malcolm Gordon would be my pick in this fight. And I think he'll shine here in his UFC debut. The other fight that's very interesting, Brett Johns and Montel Jackson. Brett Johns, coming into this, with a 16-2 record. Jackson, not as much experience, only 10 fights, but Jackson, of course, has such a good build for that division. He is 5'10" with a 75.5 inch reach. Brett Johns only 5'7" with a 70 inch reach. So Jackson has the big advantage. Johns has the experience. Just looking here at the, just kind of what people are sort of saying here. Jackson is the favorite, but Johns might be worth a play here just with his experience. Again, I know he's going to have some disadvantages there with the fact that, he's going to be, not as tall and not as long as Montel Jackson, but you look at who he's fought. I mean, Pedro Munoz, Aljamain Sterling has the knockout win over, or has the submission win over Joe Soto, that calf slicer, has the win over Tony Gravely in his last fight, which is a good win as well. So this could be an interesting one. If Johns is able to get on the inside, he might be able to do something, but Montel Jackson looks like the future of this division. My pick would be Montel Jackson, but I think there could be some value here on Brett Johns if you can get him at a good price there as well. Another interesting fight, who I referenced earlier, Grant Dawson taking on Nad Narimani. Now, I do notice your Tapology has this as a 150-pound catch weight. I'm not sure who decided that on that end. If you remember last time, Grant Dawson missed weight for featherweight, so I'm not sure if maybe it was on his end. I did speak to Grant Dawson, but not before this fight had been changed to a catch weight. At the time when I spoke to him, it was still 145, so don't know if that'll have an effect on either fighter, but I've always said this, Grant Dawson's the real deal. We saw that in the last fight over Mike Trezano, finishing him, and that was a fight where the UFC clearly was trying to figure out who the better prospect was. So, getting a guy and, with Dawson getting that win, I feel pretty good about his chances here against Nad Narimani. And just sort of looking here, Dawson is the favorite, so I think that's probably the way to go. But let's get to the main card here. I'm going to mention this fight, obviously, because it could have some implications as far as the main event goes. But Alexander Pantoja taking on Askar Askarov. So if for some reason Deiveson Figueiredo is out of his fight, Pantoja is the guy to get the call to fight for the title. So keep that in mind. But either way, this fight, very interesting. I'm going to go Pantoja in this one. Just think he's a little bit better overall. I think he's a guy that has just proven a little bit more. And I see right now he is about a 2-1 favorite. So I think he's a guy that you would want to keep an eye on as far as plays for this card. Askarov's looked good. He's only had the draw against was it Brandon Moreno? Hasn't lost. He's 11-0, but Pantoja just so much more experience. Oftentimes when I'm looking at fights like this, when they're close on paper, I do tend to look at the experience, and I think Pantoja certainly has that as far as that goes. So give me Alexander Pantoja by decision on that one. The other fight we'll take a look at here on the main card is in the flyweight division. Ariane Lipski taking on Luana Carolina. And right now, it is Ariane Lipski as a slight favorite in this one. This is a tricky one because obviously Lipski had a really good career in KSW before heading over to the UFC, but she's had a rough go in the Octagon. She lost back-to-back fights to Joanne Calderwood and Molly McCann. But let's be honest, those are two really great fighters there. I think you can't take away too much from that. But obviously, when she came into the UFC, she was 11-3. So now down here to 12-5 overall. She's 12-5 heading into this fight. Her last fight, the Isabella de Padura fight, good win there back in November, getting the decision in that one. That was a catch weight as well. I don't know who missed weight in that one, actually. It's not saying here. It was Lipski made weight. It was her opponent who didn't, so likely took advantage of that. Carolina, of course, has not fought since May of 2019. She defeated Priscilla Caochera in that fight at UFC 237. I think that's likely why she's the underdog here, is because of the fact she hasn't fought since May, whereas Lipski fought in November. So a little bit more active. Lipski also trains at a great camp at King's MMA, so we'll see how that unfolds in this fight. But like with a lot of women's fights, I think this goes the distance, and I think Lipski will get her hand raised. I think she's found her stride now, getting that last UFC win. I think she goes in there and pulls this one off by decision. Let's go to the lightweight division. Really interesting fight here between Mark Diakiese and Rafael Fitsev. And the odds makers right now do have Diakiese as the favorite, Fitsev as the underdog here. Diakiese, if you remember, he was had a lot of hype coming in the UFC, and then that hype train was halted ultimately by Drakkar Klose when he lost that split decision back at the Tough 25 finale in 2017. And he lost 2 more fights after that. Now, it looked like, maybe is this not going to work out for him? Maybe he's going to get cut here, but he was able to rebound in a big way against Joe Duffy, getting that unanimous decision win there. And then obviously in his last fight, he got that win over Lando Venata as well. Diakiese, doesn't sound like he trained an American Top Team for this camp, which would explain obviously a lot of things because of the travel going outside of London. So I don't know if he got that type of camp there. Diakiese is 5'10" with a 73-inch reach, whereas Fitsev is 5'8" with a 71.5-inch reach. So Diakiese is going to have the height and reach advantage in this fight. So I think that's also likely why he's the favorite here. They're both 27 years old. I'm going to go Diakiese in this one. I think he's got that confidence back after coming off those 3 losses. I think we've seen him be a little bit more patient, and I like the fact that he didn't really jump back into something here. His fight was scheduled in March against Stevie Ray. That was still a long ways from his last fight in September. So I like the patient approach he's been taking to these fights. Fitsev, of course, coming off that win over Alex White, who I believe is released from the UFC, is no longer in there. Lost that fight to Mustafayev before that. And then he obviously won that fight on Titan FC to get signed to the UFC earlier than that. And Diakiese's got way more UFC fights. I feel pretty comfortable picking him here. Give me Diakiese by decision or potentially by finish. I would be looking for that inside the distance prop that does end up coming out there. But Diakiese should get the job done there by decision, more likely than not, to keep his winning streak going. Now, how about this for a co-main event? I love this fight, and I feel like this is kind of flying under the radar with the 3 fights we've had recently, but really important fight for the middleweight division. We've got Jack Hermanson taking on Calvin Gastelum, and right now, Jack Hermanson is the underdog, and Calvin Gastelum's the favorite, which is kind of interesting here because Gastelum's actually coming off 2 straight losses, whereas Hermanson is only coming off 1. Gastelum, of course, losing to Darren Till at UFC 244 in a fight that I was very surprised. I thought Gastelum was going to win that fight. I did. You know, it was very, very interesting to see him lose the way he did, especially with Till having to, you know, cut all that extra weight because he was traveling. He came in very late, and he took advantage, and he took out Kelvin Gastelum. And it's so funny because that fight with Israel Adesanya before that, I mean, Gastelum nearly won that fight. He nearly became the interim champion. He knocked down Israel Adesanya, I want to say in the 4th round, but wasn't able to capitalize on that. So here he is coming off two straight losses. I think on paper, Gastelum is a better fighter, and I think he has more, you know, notable wins here. As the win over Jacare. They both have wins over Jacare, but he also had the win over Michael Bisping as well, had the win over Tim Kennedy. The only thing I'd be concerned about with this fight is the weight cut. You know, Gastelum, he did make weight his last fight, but I know it was a tough weight cut for him. You throw in the extra travel, going to Abu Dhabi, that does concern me a bit in this fight. So I think if you're looking to bet this fight, by the way, I'm going to pick Kelvin Gastelum in this fight, but I think if you're going to bet this fight for Gastelum, I would wait to see how he looks on the scales before that, because if he looks bad or the weight cut's not very good, we could have another repeat performance of the Darren Till fight. And by the way, I'm not taking anything away from Darren Till in that fight. I just felt Gastelum had a lot of advantages going in there, and he wasn't able to capitalize on it. Now, Jack Hermanson had a really good winning streak heading into that Jared Kantner fight. 4 straight wins, all finishes, all by submission. He actually had the ground and pound win over Talis Latis, but and he had the decision over Jacare Souza. But the last fight, it was a risky one. It was, you know, he wanted to fight close to home in Norway. He thought, you know, this would be the key to getting him a title shot, but he fought Jared Kantner and he got knocked out in the 2nd round. So that was a big setback for him. So Hermanson looking to avenge, or looking to bounce back in the win column. If you remember, Hermanson was supposed to fight Chris Weidman back in February, but Weidman had to pull out due to an injury, and they never rebooked that fight. They gave Weidman or Mariak Madoff, and now Hermanson's fighting Kelvin Gastelum. I do see this as a competitive fight. I mean, Hermanson clearly has a great ground game. If he's able to get this to the mat, it would be interesting to see what he could do, because if you remember, Weidman was able to submit Kelvin Gastelum back in 2017. But I think standing, I think I would give the advantage to Kelvin Gastelum. I think we've seen the knockout power like in the Bisping fight. So it'll be interesting to see if Hermanson can end up getting this fight to the map. I know Hermanson had a good training camp. I spoke to him recently. He, you know, felt really good about everything. And he actually liked this fight better than Weidman, despite Weidman being a former champion. He's like, look, Gastelum's ranked higher. I'm trying to move up in the rankings here. Let's figure that out and see what, you know, how I can get closer to a title shot here. So kudos to Jack Hermanson for wanting to take this fight. He told me that he asked for the fight. So I thought that was kind of interesting, but ultimately I got to pick Kelvin Gastelum here. I think he is the better fighter, and I think he's going to be able to keep this standing. But like I said, if you're looking to bet this, I would wait to see how Gastelum looks on the scale. Kind of like last week with Jose Aldo. I'd wait to see how he looks on the scale before placing any money on this fight. All right, let's get to the main event. Kind of everyone's saying sort of the same thing about this fight, and I'm going to sort of echo that tune here. Of course, I'm talking about Davis Figueiredo and Joseph Benavidez. Figueiredo is the 2-1 favorite in this fight. I think Figueiredo is the better fighter. I think he showed that in the last fight. The question is, can he make the weight? He missed weight last time. That's why this fight, this title is vacant that they're fighting for, as opposed to Figueiredo defending his title, because of course he knocked out Benavidez in his last fight, but there was that headbutt. Let's not ignore that. Let's not ignore that happened in that first fight. So that definitely played a role in Figueiredo winning the fight. But I feel like a lot of people looking at this fight love Joe B, and I'm one of them. I think Joe B is an awesome fighter. I think it would be a great story for him to win a UFC title, being in the sport as long as he has, but we can't blind the fact that I thought Figueiredo looked better in that last fight. And I know he missed weight, and I know he probably had some advantages by missing weight, but I think overall he did look like the better fighter in the octagon there. So I'm just going to tell people this, like, don't bet with your hearts, you know, don't bet with your, don't bet with your hearts, bet with your mind on this one. You know, if you are going to bet this fight, because I do think Figueiredo wins this fight. I don't know if Benavidez has made enough adjustments to deal with a guy like Figueiredo, who clearly looked like he had his number in that first fight. And I think he will make weight. I mean, how could you miss weight twice, right? Especially when, you know, if he misses weight again, he could get cut. I mean, there's so many implications of what could happen here, just because like that doesn't look good for anyone. You remember Anthony Johnson when he kept missing weight, like the UFC had to like make him move up a weight class. Same thing with John Lineker. So I think he's going to make weight for this fight. So if he does, I think he wins this fight. I think he could potentially finish Joseph Benavidez again. And I know a lot of people want Benavidez to win, but don't let that blind you to this fight of who is going to end up taking this one out, or who's going to end up taking the win here, just because of the fact that I do think that Benavidez isn't as good of a fighter. I mean, he's fought longer, he's got more experience, but I think if you looked at that last fight from a style perspective, I don't think there's any reason to think that Benavidez will make enough adjustments there. And I don't even think it's worth betting, just because I don't think, unless Figueiredo misses weight again, and maybe they don't have a clash of heads, I don't know. But I think in general, Figueiredo probably wins this fight and probably becomes the flyweight champion. So there you go. There's my breakdown for UFC Fight Night, Benavidez and Figueiredo. Again, if you guys have your picks for this card, let me hear them in the comment section. I'll try and reply to everyone I can. Obviously, we got 3 cards coming out, or 2 cards this week, so lots to talk about there. And for 251, like I mentioned off the top, if you guys want to give me your suggestions for who you want to see fight next, what you thought of the Volkanovski and Holloway fight, who you scored that fight to, let me know. Or also, if you want to get a hold of me, just follow me on Twitter and on Instagram at Lynch on Sports. That's the easiest way to get a hold of me. And if you guys have any questions about those fights, I'm happy to answer them in my DMs. Always open for talking fights and everything like that. This is the first show today. Very happy for you guys to tune in here. We'll go a little bit longer next time, just because we wanted to make sure we weren't giving this one too long. Next time, or in the future, I should say, this should be a live show where you guys will be able to interact and submit questions and things like that. So that's the goal with the show going forward, is it will be a preview and recap show, but obviously not as much to cover. I mean, this is a rare week where we have 2 UFC cards, so it'll be a little bit more breathing room. We should be able to go through most of the fights, if not all the fights going forward, and we'll be able to talk more specifics when it comes to the betting stuff as well. So I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe to our Line Movement YouTube channel where this is being hosted. We're going to be having a lot of good content. I'm going to be giving you guys my best interviews going forward here. So you guys saw, like I mentioned off the top, Colby Covington. We're going to have interviews like that going forward here on the channel. So make sure you tune in. We're all about original content here. MMA is a very busy space. There's a lot of YouTube channels out there. There's a lot of people doing the same interviews. We're going to try and give you different stuff. And even if we do get the same fighter, we're going to try and take a different angle on that interview. We're very aware of what is going on in the industry and everything else. So I'll plug it one more time, at Lynch on Sports. That's the easiest way you can get a hold of me, for my Twitter and Instagram. And make sure you subscribe to this YouTube channel. Just search Line Movement. You will find it there. We'll leave a description in the comment section below, and also in the description as well, where you guys can subscribe and get on the bandwagon now, because we're going to be doing some incredible things. Also, quick shout out to Dan Tom and Dan Levy. Their show is going to be out this week as well, previewing the cards on top of that. So if you guys want a little bit more in-depth analysis, I've always said this for years, if you guys have followed my work, Dan Tom is the best technical analyst in this sport. So you're really getting something from him. And Dan Levy, this guy watches tape in his sleep, it seems, when it comes to knowing all the fighters. So definitely go tune into their show, which is going to be happening every week along with my show as well. And like I said, guys, get on the bandwagon. It's never too late, never too early, so to speak. So we're going to be doing a lot of really great stuff here. Thank you so much for watching. Enjoy the 2 cards this week, and I will see you back here next week, likely on Monday, to preview and recap another card. Thanks so much for watching. I'm James Lynch, signing out.